Today we are looking at a case from the start of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to Wales. Anita Dorothy Lawrence, known to everyone simply as Dorothy, was born on the 11th of August 1889 in the small mining village of Abertrydydd in South Wales. The village lay a few miles northwest of the town of Caerphilly, and like many communities across the South Wales valleys during the late 19th century, revolved almost entirely around coal mining. The growth of the coal industry had transformed the region. Pits had rapidly expanded, railways pushed deeper into the valleys, and workers arrived from across Britain in search of employment. The completion of the railway through the Caerphilly district in 1871 made the movement of coal easier and encouraged further industrial development. With new collieries opening and the population increasing, many local families sought ways to supplement their income by renting rooms to lodgers. The Lawrence family were among those who did so. Dorothy lived with her parents, Mr. William and Mrs. Alma Lawrence, her brother also called William, and her younger sister Beatrice, at number 5 Aberfour Terrace. Her father worked on ships sailing out of Cardiff docks that carried goods overseas, and this meant that he spent long periods away from home. To bring in extra money, Mrs. Lawrence rented rooms to young working men employed in the district. This arrangement helped the family financially, although the house itself was small and overcrowded. There were only 2 bedrooms. Mrs. Lawrence shared one room with her daughters Dorothy and Beatrice, while young William slept in the other alongside the 2 lodgers, one named John Donovan, who worked as a porter at the railway station, and a young man named Noah Patrick Collins, who was known to everyone as Percy. When Mr. William Lawrence was not at sea, he slept downstairs in the lounge. Noah Patrick Collins was born in 1883 in the village of Cadexton, near Barry in South Wales. His childhood had been difficult. Both his parents died while he was still very young, and at the age of 8, he was sent to Ely Industrial School, an institution for destitute children that was connected with the workhouse. Life for young children in such establishments was strict and often lonely. He remained there for around 10 years, receiving only a basic education in a heavy disciplined environment that was common to such institutions. During the time he was there, the Elementary Education Act raised the school leaving age to 11, though for children like Percy, the standard of schooling often remained limited. Once he had finished his education, he followed the same path as many boys growing up in the industrial valleys of South Wales and went to work in the coal mines. The work there was hard. Miners laboured underground for long hours, in cramped, dusty conditions, where accidents were common, and although the wages could be better than in many other occupations, it was exhausting, dangerous and physically demanding. Percy disliked mining, and found work as soon as he was able. He joined the crew aboard a steamship and travelled overseas, managing to see far more of the world than just the valleys of South Wales. He also served during the Boer War in South Africa in the early years of the 20th century, a conflict fought between the British Empire and the Boer republics over control of territory in South Africa. The war was harsh, with British soldiers enduring difficult conditions and long campaigns across the South African countryside. When the war ended, Percy wore the medal he received for his service there with great pride. Following this, he travelled to India, where he spent time picking fruits, before travelling to North America, where he worked in Boston, and later he went on to Canada. For a young man, these experiences were unusual and exciting, yet despite his travels, he eventually returned to South Wales. The valleys were familiar to him, and mining work was always available. His brother also lived there, giving him some sense of belonging. By now it was 1907. He was 24 years old, and compared with many of the local miners, he seemed worldly and experienced. He soon found lodgings in the house of Mrs. Lawrence, at 5 Aberfour Terrace. Despite the cramped living arrangements, Percy liked the house. He had grown up without a stable family life of his own, and he found a sense of warmth and belonging in the Lawrence home. Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence were both proud of their daughter Dorothy, and everyone who knew her considered her to be an attractive, polite and charming young lady, and Percy became increasingly drawn to her. At first, Dorothy paid him little attention. He was simply another lodger in her parents' house. But over time, they spoke more frequently, and Percy entertained her with stories about his travels overseas, describing the life in India, South Africa, America and Canada. Dorothy, who had spent her life in a small Welsh mining community, found these stories fascinating, and eventually she agreed to walk out with him. On these occasions, Dorothy wore her best dress, while Percy put on his finest suit. Their walks became well known within the village, and Dorothy informed her mother that she was spending time with the lodger. Mrs. Lawrence told her daughter that she did not object, as long as Mr. Collins conducted himself properly. At the beginning, the relationship appeared harmless enough. Dorothy was a young woman enjoying the company of a young man who had seen more of the world than most people she knew. Percy, meanwhile, became deeply attached to her. Dorothy had a studio photograph taken of herself, which was fashionable among young women at the time. Such photographs were often exchanged as tokens of affection or friendship, and Percy repeatedly asked Dorothy to give him one. At first, she hesitated, perhaps teasing him by saying the pictures were too small, but eventually she agreed, and from that moment on, Percy treasured the photograph and carried it with him constantly. Despite his growing feelings for Dorothy, Percy was still restless. He disliked life in the mines and believed that his future opportunities lay overseas rather than in South Wales. He started to consider returning to America. Dorothy knew he was thinking about leaving and eventually asked him directly whether he intended to go. She admitted she would miss him if he left and hinted that she would rather he remained in Wales. Percy somehow began to convince himself that these conversations amounted to a promise of marriage, though no formal engagement existed between them. He told Dorothy that he would go to America, and once he had settled there, he would return for her. In November 1907, he travelled to Liverpool, intending to board a ship bound for New York. However, for reasons that remain unclear, he never actually sailed, and instead he returned to Abertrydu and resumed living in the Lawrence house. However, following his return, the relationship he thought he had with Dorothy began to deteriorate. She would go out and socialise without him, something that Percy very much resented, and he became intensely jealous when he learned that she had given another young man one of her photographs. He questioned her repeatedly about it, and they frequently argued. Percy started to become quite aggressive, and Dorothy's friends began to worry about her. They knew that he had a quick temper, and warned her to be careful. For a long time they had been telling her that Noah Patrick Collins was not someone with whom she should keep company, and said that in their opinion she ought to look for a man with better prospects and a calmer character. Eventually, Dorothy started walking out with another young man, and when Percy heard about it, he became very angry and told her that if he ever saw them together, he would shoot them both. His behaviour frightened her. She now talked to him as little as possible and attempted to avoid him inside the house. Though they still lived under the same roof, the friendship that had once existed between them had disappeared. The summer of 1908 was a lively period in Britain. London hosted the Olympic Games, after the planned Games in Rome had been cancelled following the eruption of Mount Vesuvius 2 years earlier. Though the national economy remained relatively strong, industrial unrest was growing as wages stagnated and inflation increased. In the mining districts, conversations about strikes and working conditions filled homes and public houses alike. Within the Lawrence household, Dorothy's brother William and the two lodgers often discussed labour disputes and the hardships facing miners. Dorothy herself paid little attention to such matters. Most of her time was spent helping her mother around the house and preparing for social events and outings with her friends. She was excited about an upcoming holiday. She did not say exactly where she intended to go, though fashionable seaside resorts were popular destinations for young people at the time. She ordered a new dress especially for the occasion. When Percy heard about her plans, he was not at all happy. The thought of Dorothy enjoying herself and going to a place where there would be other young men tormented him. Though he tried to dismiss her from his thoughts, it seemed that he was still quite obsessed with her. On Saturday the 15th of August 1908, Percy travelled to Cardiff, feeling increasingly desperate. Convinced that he could not bear to see Dorothy with another man, he decided to buy a revolver. When he discovered that he lacked sufficient money, he instead purchased 2 knives. Over the following 2 days, he brooded constantly over his life and his relationship with Dorothy. He still believed that she had promised to marry him, and her refusal to continue the relationship filled him with both jealousy and humiliation. On the evening of Sunday the 16th of August, the Lawrence family gathered together in the sitting room. It had been a warm summer day, and everyone appeared cheerful. Dorothy had spent time out with friends and happily described her activities. During her conversation, she repeatedly mentioned the name of the young man who she had recently met. Percy listened silently, growing more distressed as the evening wore on. By the time he went upstairs to bed, he was convinced that he had lost any chance of winning Dorothy back. The following morning, Monday the 17th of August 1908, Percy did not go to work at the mine. He remained in bed later than usual and eventually came downstairs after the others had begun their day. Dorothy was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Her brother William and the other lodger, John Donovan, had already left for work, while Mrs. Lawrence was upstairs. After eating breakfast, Percy asked Dorothy for a kiss. She refused. He asked again, and once more she said no, and laughed nervously, before saying that Mr. Donovan might return at any moment. This did not deter Percy. He persisted and demanded she kiss him, but Dorothy continued to refuse. Percy then calmly walked to the kitchen door and locked it. Dorothy immediately became worried. She told him to open the door and warned that if he did not, she would call for her mother. She then attempted to escape by moving around the kitchen table, but Percy forced her into a corner, took out one of the knives from his pockets, and tried to intimidate her, demanding that she submit to his advances. Dorothy strongly objected. She was now crying and shielding her face with her hands. She started to scream, and Percy, knowing that Mrs. Lawrence was upstairs, panicked, and in a desperate attempt to silence Dorothy's screams, he stabbed her. She gave a low cry and collapsed towards the floor. For some reason, Percy stabbed her again. He then got out the other knife and stabbed her again and again until one of the handles snapped off. Upstairs, Mrs. Lawrence heard her daughter scream. She rushed down to the kitchen and found the door locked. She tried desperately to open it and eventually managed to break the lock and force her way inside. The sight that confronted her was horrific. Dorothy lay bleeding on the floor while Percy stood nearby. Mrs. Lawrence cried out in horror and called for the assistance of Mr. Trowbridge, her next-door neighbour, but before he arrived, Percy had fled the house. He escaped through the streets and climbed over a fence before making his way along the railway line. A signalman named Lewis Greenway saw him and noticed that he had blood on his hand. Percy looked up and calmly said, "Fetch the police when you like. I mean to give myself up." It did not take long for police officers to arrive. They arrested Percy and took him to the police station. Percy did not hide what he had done. He gave a detailed statement describing the murder. He admitted locking the door, threatening Dorothy with knives, and stabbing her after she refused his advances. During the questioning, he was informed that the young lady, Anita Dorothy Lawrence, had died from her injuries. The murder shocked the small village of Abertrudu. Dorothy was widely regarded as a respectable and well-liked young woman, and the brutality of the crime horrified the local community. Newspapers across Wales carried reports of the killing and the confession. Many focused on Dorothy's desperate resistance and on Percy's jealousy and obsession. The trial of Noah Patrick Collins opened on Friday the 11th of December 1908 at the Glamorgan Assizes in Swansea. He stood charged with wilful murder, but although he had already signed a confession, Percy pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity. The prosecution opened by setting out the events of the 17th of August and submitting Mr. Collins' written confession to the courts, which was read aloud in full. Medical experts were called to testify, all of whom stated that they believed that Mr. Collins understood the nature and the consequences of his actions, and at the time of the offence he was legally sane. The prosecution outlined Percy's own behaviour and character, describing him as brooding, egotistical, obstinate, and antisocial. The defence challenged this medical evidence and asked Dr. Goodall to define insanity. The doctor replied that he could not define it, even if he was given a week to attempt to do so. This comment drew much laughter in the courtroom. The defence was led by Mr. Ivor Bowen, and he argued that his client had been driven by jealousy, emotional disturbance, and inherited mental instability. To support his defence, he called local witnesses from Cadoxton. Ellen Cronin, a woman who was 77 years old, told the court that she had known Mr. Collins's grandmother and described her as strange, saying that her behaviour was not normal and that she remembered her throwing away good potatoes while peeling them. She also said that Mr. Collins's father was not altogether there. Another witness named Mary Ann Matthews gave similar evidence, stating that while both the grandmother and the father were harmless, they were known locally to be insane. The defence stated that Mr. Collins' actions could be explained by a combination of emotional disturbance and hereditary mental weakness, rather than deliberate intent. Once the prosecution and defence had delivered their final arguments, the judge summed up the case, and the jury then retired to consider their verdict. However, their retirement was brief and only lasted 7 minutes before they returned with a verdict of guilty. Before sentence was passed, Mr. Noah Patrick Collins was invited to speak. Strangely, he made no expression of remorse. Instead, he stated that a girl should not break a promise to marry a man because of her mother's influence, and claimed that the relationship had ended due to Mrs. Alma Lawrence's dislike of him. The judge stated that Mr. Collins had been found guilty of one of the most atrocious murders ever tried in his court, and added that the prisoner had received a fair trial and that everything that could have been said on his behalf had been presented. He then sentenced Noah Patrick Collins to death. When Percy had first been arrested, the police had discovered Dorothy's photograph among his possessions. The image remained deeply important to him, and after sentencing, the judge ordered that the photograph should be returned while he awaited his execution. An appeal for mercy was submitted to the Home Secretary, Herbert Gladstone, but after considering the case, he refused to commute the sentence. During his final days in prison, Percy wrote a lengthy confession and tried to justify his actions. In his writing, he alternated between remorse, self-pity, and attempts to excuse the murder. He spent his last night at Cardiff Prison restless and unable to sleep properly. Early the following morning, he was visited by a priest who administered the sacrament. Reports described the scene as solemn yet very calm. As the town hall clock struck 8 on Wednesday the 30th of December 1908, Percy stepped onto the trapdoor. The white hood was drawn over his head, the noose around his neck, and within seconds, the execution had been carried out. Public interest in the hanging was surprisingly limited. Fewer than 50 people had reportedly gathered outside the prison walls to hear the news that Percy had been hanged. Afterwards, he was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. When at the gallows, Percy was wearing the South African medal he had earned during the Boer War, and also carried a locket containing Dorothy Lawrence's photograph, the same photograph she had reluctantly agreed to give him during the happier days of their acquaintance. Whether the photograph was buried with him has never been established. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.